August 13, 1940, 3:15 in the afternoon. The skies over the English Channel explode into chaos. 1,485 German aircraft surge across the water in 3 massive aerial armadas. Luftflotte 2 attacks from the east, Luftflotte 3 from the center, and Luftflotte 5 strikes from across the North Sea. In the first 18 hours of Adlertag Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe penetrates deep into British airspace. The Luftwaffe destroys nearly 50 RAF fighters on the first day, damaging airfields and radar stations before the squadrons can fully scramble. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, notes in his diary that night, "The British defences are stretched to the breaking point. The enemy was caught unaware. The path to London is opening. The British resistance seems fragmented and weak. Hitler is euphoric." His prediction that the United Kingdom would sue for peace, collapsing like a house of cards, seems to be confirmed hour by hour. But what Hitler didn't know was that Winston Churchill had already activated a plan that German strategists considered industrially impossible, a plan that would break the Luftwaffe's back and turn a certain German victory into the first major defeat of the Nazi war machine. The problem was simple, but devastating for the British. Music swells. 80% of Britain's aircraft industry was concentrated in a few vulnerable cities in the south. The Supermarine Spitfire factories in Southampton, the Hawker Hurricane plants near London, the Rolls-Royce engine works in Derby. Everything was within minutes of flight time for German bombers stationed in occupied France. At the speed the Luftwaffe was destroying infrastructure, those factories would be rubble in weeks. Without factories, there would be no Spitfires. Without Spitfires, there is no RAF. Without the RAF, Operation Sea Lion proceeds, and Britain falls. The German generals had calculated this with mathematical precision. General George Thomas, head of the War Economy and Armaments Office, presented a report to Hitler in July 1940. "Once we obliterate the industrial centers of Southampton and Coventry, the British capacity to produce fighter aircraft will drop by 75%. The war will end due to a lack of material before the autumn gales begin." If you want to discover how the British government turned this apparent death sentence into the greatest logistical miracle of the war, please hit that like button. It helps us share more stories that changed the course of history. Music. The plan that Churchill and his Minister of Aircraft Production, Lord Beaverbrook, activated in the summer of 1940 had no precedent in British history. It was called the Dispersal Scheme combined with the Shadow Factory system, and its objective was literally impossible according to any known logistical standard. The goal? To fracture the massive, centralized aircraft plants and scatter them into thousands of tiny, secret locations across the countryside. We are not talking about simply building new factories. We are talking about dismantling complex assembly lines, loading high-precision tooling onto trucks, transporting them through a country under constant blackout and bombardment, and reassembling them in garages, laundries, and bus depots. The newly appointed minister, Lord Beaverbrook, issued a direct order to the industry magnates. "You have days to disperse production. If you fail, you will be replaced." It wasn't a metaphor. Beaverbrook had the power to commandeer any property in the kingdom. He had to take a factory like Supermarine in Southampton, which occupied acres of dockland, break it into small pieces, and hide it in the suburban sprawl. German intelligence intercepted communications about the frantic reorganization. The Luftwaffe intelligence chief, Beppo Schmid, dismissed it as desperate propaganda. He wrote, "It is physically impossible to decentralize heavy aviation industry at that scale during an air offensive. The British are lying to maintain morale." They were not lying. The dispersal began under the falling bombs. In Southampton, workers were dismantling jigs and tooling music while the Heinkels bombed the city. Every lathe, every hydraulic press, every sheet metal roller was tagged, numbered, and loaded onto lorries. The workers labored music in 16-hour shifts, sleeping on the floors of the workshops they were taking apart, eating rations of tea and sandwiches while the air raid sirens wailed overhead. Chief designer R.J. Mitchell's successors documented the process. "We had heavy fuselage presses weighing tons. Dismantling them usually took months. We did it in days. Men worked until they dropped, we replaced them, and they kept working. On September 26, the supermarine factory in Woolston was finally destroyed by the Luftwaffe. But the Germans bombed empty shells. The machinery was gone. The vital tooling was already hidden in a laundry business, a garage, and a hotel basement miles away. The Germans looked at reconnaissance photos of the ruins and celebrated. But moving the factories was only half the problem. The other half was making them work. The trucks arrived in Reading, Trowbridge, and Leicester, towns that had never built a fighter plane before. The equipment was unloaded into civilian buildings that weren't designed for industry. There were no proper power lines, no overhead cranes, no proper lighting. The British solution was brutally simple: improvise everything simultaneously. While one team punched holes in the roofs of bus depots to vent exhaust, another team was already bolting the machinery to the concrete floors of auto repair shops. While electricians illegally tapped into the municipal grid, women, who had never held a rivet gun before, were already producing the first fuselage section's music under blackout curtains that stifled the ventilation. In the dispersed workshops around Southampton, production didn't just restart, it accelerated. The first dispersed Spitfire rolled out of a converted hangar weeks after the main factory was destroyed. It was sent directly to Fighter Command, where the German Bf 109s were swarming over Kent. Type Spitfire in the comments if you are discovering this incredible story. The numbers of the dispersal defy comprehension. Hundreds of manufacturing units were created between June and October 1940. Thousands of civilians were drafted into the factories, including specialized engineers, mechanics, and housewives. The Civilian Repair Organization, CRO, used scrap metal and spare parts to cannibalize damaged planes, putting them back in the air in 48 hours. And all this happened while the RAF was losing pilots day after day in the skies. The German ace Adolf Gorland, music commander of JG-26, wrote in September 1940. Our intelligence reports that the RAF is down to its last 50 fighters. It is impossible. We destroy them, yet they appear in greater numbers the next day. It's as if they grow from the grass. It wasn't impossible. It was the reality the Germans refused to accept. Instead, what the Luftwaffe hadn't anticipated was that Beaverbrook hadn't just moved the factories, he had streamlined them. The bureaucracy was cut. The finish on the aircraft was roughened to save time. The dispersed network of workshops fed into central assembly hangars. The efficiency increased dramatically. Before the war, building a Spitfire was a craftsman's job. Under the shadow factory system, it became a mass production miracle. In early 1940, production was sluggish. By the height of the battle, the simplified processes meant a fighter could be pushed out in a fraction of the time. The British hadn't just saved their industry, music, they had transformed it into a war machine more resilient than anything Germany could match. The Luftwaffe paid the price. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the backbone of the Luftwaffe, was an excellent fighter in 1939. Its fuel injection and climb rate were superior. But the Spitfire Mk1 and 2 coming out of the dispersed factories had the Merlin engine and superior turn rates. The dispersed factories began retrofitting them with constant speed propellers and better armor. German pilots found that the RAF refused to die. General Field Marshals described the encounters: "Our bombers' music were ravaged. The Hurricanes attacked the bombers like wolves, while the Spitfires kept our fighters busy. It was a production massacre." The numbers are devastating. In July 1940, Germany had a numerical advantage. But by October 1940, the tables had turned. German fighter production in 1940 averaged about 156 per month. British fighter production, under Beaverbrook's ruthless drive, skyrocketed to over 450 per month during the heat of the battle. By the end of the year, the disparity became grotesque. Germany produced roughly 1,870 fighters in the second half of 1940. The United Kingdom produced over 4,280. The factories the Germans thought they had destroyed music were producing fighters at a rate Germany never matched during the Battle of Britain. If you are still watching this, You are part of history itself. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more revelations like this. The German invasion plan, Operation Sea Lion, was postponed indefinitely in September 1940, not just because the RAF fought bravely, but because the Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority against an enemy that replenished its losses faster than they could be shot down. Of the thousands of German aircraft committed to the battle, nearly 1,887 were destroyed by the end of October. But the failure of the Bf 109 to secure the skies was just the beginning. The Heinkels, the Dorniers, the Stukas all suffered the same fate. It didn't matter how technically advanced the German planes were. Music the UK could produce 2 Spitfires for every one Messerschmitt lost, and while a German pilot shot down over Kent was captured, an RAF pilot could parachute down and be in a new plane by tea time. The total tonnage of bombs dropped on British industry failed to stop the output. The majority of the Luftwaffe losses were caused by fighters produced in shadow factories that Hitler believed he had neutralized. Albert Speer, Hitler's later Minister of Armaments, admitted after the war, "Our greatest strategic error was underestimating the British industrial resilience. We believed that bombing the main centers would end the war. Instead, we gave them a reason to disperse and reorganize. We turned a centralized target into a hydra. It wasn't just a miscalculation, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of what they were facing." The Germans thought in terms of terror and territory. Bomb London, break the will. Churchill and Beaverbrook thought in terms of industrial capacity. As long as the workshops hummed, the war continued. The dispersal of 1940 was not an act of desperation, it was the most important strategic logistical decision of the early war. The conditions were grueling. Workers in the dispersed plants worked under blackouts, with poor ventilation, suffering from fatigue and rationing. They slept in shifts under the workbenches. The death toll from bombing raids on industrial towns like Coventry and Southampton was high. Music. Thousands of civilians died so that the few in the skies had their machines. It is an uncomfortable reality. The dispersal saved Britain, but the human cost in the cities was monstrous. But without that dispersal, without those sacrifices, the swastika would have flown over Parliament, and the history of the 20th century would have been very different. The last Spitfire operational in the war flew missions until the very end in 1945. It was the direct descendant of the planes saved in 1940. From the desperate days of July 1940 to the fall of Berlin, the British aviation industry music produced over 20,351 Spitfires. Each of those planes represented a defeat for the German plan of 1940. Each was proof that the impossible method of Beaverbrook and Churchill was not only possible, it was the recipe to destroy the Luftwaffe and win the most critical air battle in human history. What do you think of this unprecedented logistical operation? Did you know the real scale of the British shadow factory system? Leave us a comment and subscribe to our channel. Every week we bring verified and fascinating stories